Hello there. This is Ken. I just wondering, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and start the share screen. And it's been all this new modern technology here. And how is that looking on the Zoom?
Looks great.
Okay, there we go. So today's talk is the Mahakaruna. It's September 10th of 2022. And we're looking at the Aquarian Almanac series here today. So this is the email that Truth set up, the little visual, the one law of compassion. And I have a quote here by Arthur Schopenhauer, which I'll come back to in a minute. Compassion is the basis for morality. As we were hearing a moment ago about the Dalai Lama, that karuna and compassion is from the heart. This is very important. Today happens to be the full moon in September. And in the fall here, close to the autumnal equinox, it's called the harvest moon. So I thought I'd put a little bit of grain and harvest there as we collectively harvest the wisdom of our studies and works as our theosophy group that we are. In the Aquarian Almanac, there was a quote from the journal Hermes. So I have a little Art Deco drawing of Hermes here, someone made, I got from the internet. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, and the message from the Aquarian Almanac, the quote was as follows: one must become the willing servant of, quote, the one law of compassion, unquote, and sacrifice Mahakaruna and Mahayana, or Mahayagna. And then to go into these definitions, it's like, well, what are these things? So Mahakaruna is really a compound Sanskrit word, Maha being great, like Mahatma, like the fellow that helped Indian independence. So Maha is great. It also could mean transcendent or transcendental, which are other kind of English language meanings and translations of this word in Sanskrit, Maha. Karuna is compassion. And we were just hearing about compassion as being both a service to others and then also something from the heart. Now, in theosophy and in this voice of the silence and in the secret doctrine, it's called the law of laws. And the other thing in the Hermes quote was Mahakaruna and Mahayagna. And the question is, what was that? So I had to look that up too. And it looks like there's two spellings with the JN or the GN, depending on how you transliterate from Sanskrit to English. And it's sacrifice. And it could be a group of important offerings or an act of devotion. So we have, let me back up for a second. The quote from Hermes for today: one must become the willing servant of the one law of compassion and sacrifice. And the sacrifice is the Mahakaruna and Mahayana. And just to, I won't go into the details of this or read it or recite it or chant it, but there is a Mahayana Buddhist chant, the Mahakaruna mantra, and it's in Sanskrit here. I won't get into the details, but just to say there is such a thing, and it's very important in Mahayana Buddhism, this Mahakaruna chant of compassion. The other thing that we started out with today is a quote from Arthur Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer is an interesting character. Just a little digression here for a moment. He's a German philosopher from his birthday was 1788 and he died in the year 1860. So in that part of one century, part of another. And here's a quote: as compassion is the basis for morality. Now, curiously enough, Schopenhauer was a student of Immanuel Kant. And he also used some of Plato's ideas in his writings. But the interesting thing about Arthur Schopenhauer is he's one of the first Europeans to incorporate Eastern philosophy into that tradition of Western philosophy. Turns out there was an acquaintance of his, we'll go back here, named Friedrich Meyer. And Friedrich Meyer was an Orientalist in the 1800s. And he introduced Arthur Schopenhauer to the Vedanta, the Vedas, and to the Upanishads. And so this other German fellow Orientalist academic, Friedrich Meyer, brought some of these ideas to Arthur Schopenhauer, who then incorporated this little quote here: compassion is the basis for all morality. And indeed, as theosophists, we have things like in the TSA, for instance, there's the Theosophical Order of Service, and in the ULT, we do talk about the importance of being of service to others. And the Bodhisattva path is indeed a path of service. And that's a very moralistic value system. Coming to the Dalai Lama again, compassion in everyday life. There's a quote here: if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. So it's an admonition or a bit of advice from the Dalai Lama in our everyday life, how we can bring compassion into the day-to-day world of our morality, of how we interact with other people. And some might say, in terms of Western philosophy, the idea of the I, the we, and the it, or the good, the true, and the beautiful, that there's a sort of a triad. And one way of thinking about the I, the we, and the it, or the good, the true, and the beautiful, is that the true represents something abstract, an it thing, an outside thing. The beautiful is really the I, the individual kind of perception, you might say, of what we experience and what we think about and what we feel. So the I is very subjective and very internal. So we have the true and the beautiful, but what about the good? So what's this third thing? So this third thing really is about our moral behavior, our interaction with other people, and as the Buddhists would say, all sentient beings. And so that gets us in the direction of this bodhisattva path and this whole idea of compassion as a universal law. Now, I mentioned this word bodhisattvas. So the Dalai Lama here, it's a little slide in this picture, I think he's the 14th or 15th Dalai Lama from Tibet. He's the incarnation, according to the Tibetan Buddhist ideas, he's the incarnation of Avalokitesvara, or the Tibetan have a different name for the same bodhisattva as Chenrezig or Chenrezig. So we have this idea that there are these advanced humans that are no longer living in a human body, and they're bodhisattvas, and they're very concerned about the care and feeding, or the compassionating us as humans in our physical form. So I won't go into all the details here, but everyday concepts of compassion have to do with empathy, being gentle, understanding to the suffering of others, practicing compassion, helping other people. And we can practice compassion anytime. Just good thoughts is a good idea. Sending good energy, as some of the new age people talk about. Each time we practice compassion, it grows stronger in us. It's like a skill or a practice, like playing the piano or learning to speak or baking a cake. You might have the first 5 times you bake the cake, it doesn't turn out right, but then finally it comes out okay. So practice and skills are important. And that means that in everyday life, compassion can be a skill to practice it. And compassion builds bridges of rapport and understanding. And that's a very important thing in my life and my work professionally. But in our just everyday life, it's important in family life. So the compassion and the bridge building between the family members, say the traditional husband and wife, or the partners, and then the kids or other people that are involved. So compassion is important. But what about these bodhisattvas? So these bodhisattvas are human beings that have gone through a path of sacrifice, devotion, and renunciation. And in our theosophical concepts about reincarnation and karma and this sort of septenary nature of our being, they have left the lower body, you might say, the Shula Sarira, and they're in a more rarefied state, but still kind of connected to humans. And in this picture, there's a statue of Avalokitesvara. It's a hard name to say. I have to go back a slide here to read it. Avalokitesvara, that bodhisattva. In looking at Mahakaruna and the voice of the silence, this law of compassion is a law of nature. And in the Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky talks about universal laws and laws of nature. This is an abstract law, though. And so there's a fascinating thing of comparing these two meanings of compassion. We have the everyday distinction of compassion that we were just talking about a moment ago, how we behave moralistically with the, our subjective, the I, the we, and the it, the we part, the morality, how do we deal with other people? But this abstract law, as we move up this hierarchy, through that septenary nature of reality and mankind and people, and then get into these other concepts of the emanation of the universe, we come to this abstraction. And to say that it has no attributes is a very curious thing. And it's hard to kind of wrap our mind around what is something that has no attributes that's an abstract law. And Blavatsky says it's the one law. So what about this one law? So from the proem in the Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, she talks about the germ of the universe, or the seed or the egg of the universe, how it's coming through this. I like to think of it as a gearing down, like the analogy would be a motor of a car that's going at, say, 2,000 or 3,000 RPMs, and then it kind of gears down to the tires on the ground that are not going that fast at all. They're going, 30, 40, 50 miles per hour. They're going at a different RPM, a different speed. So in our theosophical ideas and doctrines, which are not dogmas, in our doctrines, there's this idea that there's an emanation. And so this germ is the universe emanating into the sevenfold nature. And there are these entities or beings, the Dhyan Chohans, whose purpose is to manifest this one supreme energy, and they manifest this one law that we're talking about, this law of compassion. And the other thing she says in the proem and in stanza 4 is that they're the laws of nature. And essentially we might say that ultimately these, quote, laws, plural, boils down to this one law, and this one law of compassion. And so just the words of stanza 4 are as follows. Listen, ye sons of the earth, to your instructors, the sons of fire. Learn there is neither first nor last, for all is one number, issued from no number. So at this point, I'm trying to point us in the direction of abstraction, and numbers certainly are abstract. You say, well, what is a number? We have 1, 2, or 3, and we think about triads and trinities and things like that. But yet, if you look at the number 3, it's not about anything at all. And so to get our minds going in the direction of how could we have an abstract law that has no attributes? It's like, well, does 3 have attributes? Maybe, maybe not. But certainly you could have three things, like 3 cups or 3 people in a room, or Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, a Christian Trinity. But those are all of a sudden have forms and attributes and qualities to them. And so to say, well, how can we have something that has no qualities? And that's, I think the best we can do is like a Zen Buddhist master is kind of point us in the direction of something that has no attributes, but we can't really talk about it. But I just wanted to kind of set the stage of this law of compassion that has no attributes. That's really at the beginning of the universe. And that's very important. Another word I like to think of with regard to compassion is love. Now that's an overused 4-letter word, love, L-O-V-E, but yet I think it ties in with so many different religions that talk about love as a universal thing, the love of God, and things like the Greeks would talk about storge or agape, those kind of Greek versions of love. So love is another way of thinking of compassion, but to take it to the level of being abstract is amazing. So let's see, did I go backwards? Oh yeah, there we go. So in terms of going in this direction of abstractness, and what about universal law without attributes? Going back to the hints that Blavatsky gives us in the verbiage of stanza 4, that things issue from a number, but then there's no number. So how do we go from numbers to no number and yet have this emanation that's coming out? One thing in the world of mathematics is squaring and multiplying. So, simple things we can imagine and easily think of from school days is 2 times 2 is 4. So we get that. Or 4 times 4 is 16. But then if you do the opposite function of multiplication, it's called a square root. So the square root of 16 is going to be 4. So it's the number that you multiply 2 times by itself to get that number 4. So somewhere along the line, some crazy mathematicians who are quasi-philosophers came up with this idea of the square root of -1. But that's not a real number at all. There's no number that you can square to get -1. So they all of a sudden invented another set of numbers from the real numbers, which are attributeless, but yet have some kind of qualities, to these imaginary numbers. So it's like, wait a minute, how can we have real numbers and imaginary numbers? And I think the distinction and the analogy of having everyday compassion that we can think of as we're interacting with, feeding our cat or walking our dog or being nice to our family members, everyday compassion, avoiding road rage, being, kind and courteous to other drivers on the freeway, slowing down and letting them pass when they're blinking to get ahead of us, versus this abstract law of compassion that has no attributes. It's like, So using this analogy of numbers, of real numbers and imaginary numbers and the square root of -1, it kind of points us in the direction, like a Zen Buddhist master say, okay, how can we talk about something that we can't talk about? We can at least point you in the direction of it. So that's what I brought up here with the square root of -1. In the voice of the silence, and I forget if I put the voice of the silence in my slides or not, but in the voice of the silence is very poetical, and Blavatsky talks about the obligatory pilgrimage that we have in our incarnations in our lifetime, that we're going along this path. And as Theosophists, we certainly have stepped onto the path, and the voice of the silence warns us about stepping onto that path to do various cleansings, you might say, to various spiritual disciplines and renunciations, so that we're ready and able to pursue that path. And certainly Raja Yoga is one of the ideas that Hinduism and Buddhism talk about, and Theosophists talk about that, to use various disciplines. And the first one, of course, is going to be like the Chela or the Arhat. The Chela practices concentration, the dhyana. And then you can get into something more advanced than that concentration. You can get into a contemplation, the dharana. And so there's these different things we can do along the path, different techniques. And like earlier, I was talking about the skill of compassion, to practice that and get better at that. So we can practice concentration, mental concentration, and then we can practice this contemplation and meditation as we then contemplate a concept. And then in the voice of the silence, there's a lot of talk about withdrawing from the senses, and even things like how and where to meditate, meditate on a certain grass mat and a deer skin, things along those lines. We may not have access to that in our day-to-day life, but certainly we can have a special place in our home to practice this work on the path. And some of the things I'll read from some quotes from the voice of the silence here, that as one advances on this pathway, one then becomes, as you get more and more withdrawn from the senses, and physically, mentally, morally indifferent and insensible to pleasure or pain, then you can become more of that willing instrument, if you will, that sacrificial willing instrument of this one law of compassion. So on the one hand, it seems sort of contradictory. It's like, well, I'm letting go of all these things, attachments, but yet you're still participating in the world, because we're still in our body, still in the vehicle. And the idea is that then the vehicle becomes this, you might say, devoted, sacrificial, renounced vehicle, because we're still, while we're alive in these moments of being alive, in the waking, dreaming, deep dreamless sleep part of life, we're going to be in our vehicles. It's not until at the beginning of the voice of the silence, it talks about, it alludes to Turiya, that fourth state. And one thing from the beginning of the voice of the silence talks about waking up and realizing that when we look at ourselves, we see ourselves as not really different than a dream image. And that's that fourth state of consciousness. But in the meantime, while we're in day-to-day life, in the waking and dreaming sort of the three states of consciousness in our day-to-day 24-hour cycle, with that law of cyclicity, we can do things, and we can sacrifice and renounce and practice being withdrawn from the senses. And as one progresses on this path, the voice of the silence says that we can then become a master of the day. And that would be a master of the whole Manvantara, that whole sense of the form of reality with this periodicity of the universe, the pralaya and Manvantara. So we could be a master of the form of reality that we're living in. And another early thing, which seems, again, this contradictory thing, to subdue the great delusion, and that's the delusion of separateness. and the delusion that we're separate individuals and that we actually are part of this one consciousness that's connected to this one law, and that the Dayan Chohans are emanations that are servants of that one law, and they manifest that one law. Now, the Buddha is also called Tathagata. So one quote here: "O thou candidate for nature's hidden lore, if one would follow in the steps of holy Tathagata, whose gifts and powers are not for self, wouldst thou thus dam the waters born on Sumeru? Shalt thou divert the stream for thine own sake, or send it back to the prime source along the crests of cycles? If thou wouldst have the stream of hard-earned knowledge, of wisdom heaven-born, remain sweet running waters, thou shouldst not leave it to become a stagnant pond. Know, if of Amitabha, the boundless age, thou wouldst become co-worker, then thou shed the light acquired like the Bodhisattva twain upon the span of all three worlds. Know that the stream of superhuman knowledge of the Deva wisdom thou hast won must from thyself the channel of Alaya be poured forth onto another bed." So here in this very poetical language from the voice, we hear parts about that path that we're on, this obligatory pilgrimage, and that we can move forward as we go through these different experiences in our life and these different practices and disciplines. So HPB has an interesting essay, and I don't have the exact quote. I didn't have time to put it down here on the slide, but basically it says that Theosophy is not Buddhism. And that's an interesting little distinction, because you got all kinds of things in the 1800s, spiritualism for a little while, then left that and got close to Buddhism. And then in her writing, some people were mistaking that Theosophy was just Buddhism with a different name, but just, no, it's not Buddhism. But Buddhism is its own religion. It has its own traditions and rituals and policies and procedures and that sort of thing. But a lot of the theosophical ideas that HPB has brought into Theosophy, and of course, there's a lot of Hindu ideas as well, because Buddhism derived from Hinduism in a sense. Gautama Siddhartha was born and raised as a Hindu, and then started a new thing when he became enlightened and came to see the insights that he saw. Then within Buddhism, there's the Theravada and the Mahayana, two different schools. Theosophy is more closely aligned with the Mahayana school. And just a few words here, it's also known as the Great Vehicle, the Mahayana Buddhism, founded in China and Japan. It's Buddhism for the masses, that's one way to think of it. But it also really embraces the idea of bodhisattvas, these advanced spiritual beings, these chelas who became arhats, who then are now more advanced bodhisattvas, as these wise, helpful, compassionate beings. And of course, this Dalai Lama that we're talking about earlier today is the incarnation of one of these bodhisattvas. And the goal, interestingly enough, is not just for individual escape from this wheel of life and death and reincarnation, but it's salvation of all humanity. And one might even say salvation of all sentient beings through self-sacrifice. And that happens through the enlightened views, through these bodhisattvas. And in the voice of the silence, as I was mentioning a moment ago, there is a description of this path, and she'll talk about various keys or portals in the path in the voice of the silence. So it gets rather complex and detailed and specific. I won't go into all that today, but that is part of the voice of the silence and the path. Devotion is a big part of that. Rituals and viewing things as sacred is very important. Disciplines, having disciplines in one's life, even in this physical body, in this world that we're in, disciplines are useful as well. And then we have renunciation. And that's been a word in English language I've been grappling with for many, many months, if not a couple of years. So what is this renunciation thing? They're funny English words. It's like, what does this mean? And I think in a sense, for me, it translates to simpler language to be letting go of something, to release something. And perhaps some of the renunciations, as it talks about in the voice of the silence, is releasing one's attachment to the organs of sense and the objects of the sense organs. So on the one hand, that paradox of living in the world and being in the world, but yet not being attached to the world. Or, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, performing our swadharma, our duty, but yet not being attached to the results of the duties. So the renunciation is a kind of a release or kind of a letting go. And that I think is an important thing. And that's, as I've been meditating and thinking about, what is this renunciation worth and the sacrifice of that? The thing that has occurred to me lately, though, as we talk about this law of compassion, both in our human form and then in the abstract bodhisattva form, is this idea of responsibility. And so let's see here. So going up a couple slides here, I talked about the path has a fork in the road. And that fork in the road is what I'm going to get to next here. So, and I was just reading a little bit from the Verse to the Silence. One of the things in that fork of the road is that as the Chela and the Arhat and the advanced human goes through these different stages and is able to have that compassion and to feel the sorrows. Let me read a little bit more from the voice here. Alas, when once thou hast become like the pure snow in the mountain vales, cold and unfeeling to the touch, warm and protective to the seed that sleepeth deep beneath its bosom. 'Tis now that snow which must receive the biting frost of the northern blasts, thus shielding from their sharp and cruel tooth the earth that holds the promised harvest, the harvest that will feed the hungry. Self-doomed to live through future kalpas, unthanked and unperceived by man, wedged as a stone with countless other stones which form the guardian wall. Such is thy future if the seventh gate thou passest. Built by the hands of many masters of compassion, raised by their tortures, by their blood cemented, it shields mankind, since man is man, protecting it from further and far greater misery and sorrow. So indeed, in this fork in the road, as one advances through these stages and then does get, like Gautama Siddhartha, to more advanced consciousness and more advanced stages of awareness, the fork in the road is to take a Buddha and to leave all of this manifested world and then just to go on to nirvana and wait around until the next cycle of Manvantara and Pralaya to reincarnate again, or maybe whenever that'll happen. That's one fork in the road, or the road that I would say is the road of responsibility, which here in Theosophy and Mahayana Buddhism is taken as a very important moralistic decision. Back to that I, we, and it, back to that we decision, that responsibility for the suffering of all humans and of all sentient beings. And that would be the path of the Bodhisattva. And so that's what I mean by these two paths. So as we go along this obligatory pilgrimage and we're learning and studying and reading things, and then with our part of our body, we read and study with the mind, and then with the heart part of the body, get into this compassion thing. It's like, okay, where am I going with all this? So the Voice of the Silence outlines this obligatory pilgrimage, but then at the end there's a fork in the road. You can either go to the Prajita Buddha side or the Bodhisattva side. So we're promoting the other choice. We're promoting the moralistic choice of going to and one of the things, just before we get into bodhisattvas, is koshas. So in both Hinduism and in Theosophy, there's this idea that our consciousness is contained within shells or sheaths or containers or husks, if you will, or bodies. Now, for some reason, Blavatsky and the Theosophists came up with this idea of seven. So we have the septenary nature of ourselves. The other Buddhists have, the Hindus have the five koshas, but it's a similar thing. It's where we have the physical sheath, the Annamaya kosha, the pranayama, the life force sheath, our prana, our living energy, the manayama, which would be the manas, the kama and the manas part of us. Then we have the wisdom, Vijnana Maya, and then the bliss body, the Ananda Maya. But in parallel to that, we have the septenary nature of reality that we describe in Theosophy. So those are the koshas. Meanwhile, as we go through these cycles of rebirth and reincarnation on this obligatory pilgrimage through traveling through the different planets and things that are thought to do, there's another kind of body, not the koshas, but the kayas. Let me see here. So I have the kayas for everyday life. So these kayas are these bodies or these sheaths for the advanced post-human form of consciousness. And back to the Mahayana Buddhism, we have the Trikaya doctrine, and we have the Buddha as a person who's just recently now gone from the physical form into the spiritual form. We have the Nirmanakaya, and then we have the next Buddha advancing more in understanding and compassion and consciousness, the Sambhogakaya, and then this ultimate truth body, the Dharmakaya. And it's here where this fork in the road can occur. So it doesn't occur in our physical body lifetime. It occurs in this later lifetime, this later part of our obligatory pilgrimage. And that would be going from the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and then the Dharmakaya. Here are the three kayas. And I didn't get to put it in a slide. Let me go up one. Yeah, I didn't get to put it in a slide, but I'll just read a little bit from the Voice of the Silence. In the Voice, Blavatsky references these three bodies repeatedly throughout the text of the Voice of the Silence. So the first of these is the Nirmanakaya, and we'd say this is the first of the ethereal form that one would assume, as I'm reading here, that one would assume when leaving the physical, he would appear in the astral body, having in addition all the knowledge of the adept. The Bodhisattva develops it in himself as he proceeds on the path. Having reached the goal and refused its fruition, he remains on earth as an adept, and when he dies, instead of going to nirvana, he remains in that glorious body that he has woven for himself, invisible to the uninitiated mankind, and he'll watch over mankind and protect it. That middle body is the Sambhogakaya, and now this is the same as the Nirmanakaya, that first astral form, but it has three perfections, and one of which is the obliteration of all earthly concerns. And that's that sort of paradoxical thing I was talking about as we go along our own individual concentration, meditation, contemplation, while we're still in our bodies. We want to withdraw from the senses and be not attached to physical, objects of the senses, the five senses, or six, however you call it, and the organs of the senses and the objects of the senses. And it's like, how can I do that? But even having done that in the physical form, then when we're in this astral form, the Sambhogakaya has now obliterated their attention to earthly concerns. So that seems kind of strange, but yet it's another description in words of what happens to people and beings. That third body, that third kaya of this renunciation and sacrifice is the Dharmakaya. And that is the body of the complete Buddha, according to Mahayana Buddhism, and adopted into the theosophical ideas. So as one goes through these more advanced forms, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, that is again at yet another deeper and more profound level, withdrawn from concerns at one level, yet is able to go into the Dharmakaya body. And now here's where the fork in the road occurs. So this is the complete body. I'll read the footnote here. It's no body at all, but an ideal breath. Consciousness merged in universal consciousness, or soul devoid of every attribute. Again, I'll pause a moment. Devoid of attributes. So again, we're back to that square root of -1. How can we imagine something that's devoid of attributes that yet is this advanced human being? That's the Dharmakaya. It's hard to talk about. We can just kind of point in the direction of that. So the consciousness merged into universal consciousness, the soul devoid of every attribute. Once a Dharmakaya, the adept or the Buddha then leaves behind every possible relation or every thought of this earth that we're in. And thus, to be enabled to help humanity, the adept who has won this right to nirvana renounces the Dharmakaya body. It lets go of that. Again, that renunciation word. It renounces the Dharmakaya body in mystic parlance. And it goes back a notch, or goes back a rung on the ladder to the Sambhogakaya. However, now this is like Sambhogakaya Part 2. So you had the first Sambhogakaya is working your way up, but then you have the reverse trajectory and you come back to Sambhogakaya. However, now this time around, there's a great and complete knowledge. And this Sambhogakaya remains in the Nirmanakaya body. And the esoteric school of Buddhism teaches that Gautama Buddha, the Gautama Siddhartha Buddha, and several of his arhats are in this Nirmanakaya body, but yet they've renounced that and remain sort of, you might say, in Sambhogakaya Part 2. So they're kind of like part this and part that. It's hard to understand, but clearly it's something that's really beyond our everyday experience because it's after we've left our physical form. And right now we're still in our physical form. Certainly I am, and presumably you guys are too on the other side of your Zoom cameras. So we're in this physical body, and to conceptualize these astral forms of the three kayas, the Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya, is difficult, although we can talk about it, and there's words to describe it in Sanskrit. And again, that fork in the road thing, that reverse, we kind of turned around, made a U-turn on the highway of this obligatory pilgrimage. It's been a sacrifice. And for me, I think, as I wrote here on this slide, it's responsibility for all sentient beings. The motivation or the reason to make that sacrifice, as we're far advanced on this journey, is to accept and to embody responsibility. And that would, I think, make the advanced being similar to the Dayan Chohans, who are manifestations of this one law. So it's a very fascinating idea. And then back to the idea of this one law of compassion, and the responsibility to influence the thoughts, the decisions, and the actions of all of the other sentient beings that are still in the manifested world. Sometimes I'll call it the stage of space and time. So we're living in space-time, the Einsteinian space-time. So we're in this theater of space and time, but yet outside of that theater of space-time, there's these other realities where the Kaya entities would be, and the Dayan Chohans. And then, is it that the Bodhisattva is influencing or moving us all in the direction that each of these sentient beings would be free from the balance sheet of karma, that would be acting in the world and yet doing it in such a way that we're free of the pluses and minuses of the debits and credits of our karmic action? And so we have compassion as the abstract law. And is it that abstract law that is really the law of karma? And for me, that was a little bit of a confusion in my mind as I was preparing for today. Is this one law of compassion? And as Blavatsky talks about in the poem and in the stanzas, one universal law that the Dayan Chohans are manifesting as we kind of move down towards our level. Are those really the same things? The law of karma and the law of compassion really identical as this one law? What is this one law? So let me wind down today with something that has been here in the lodge on a placard, and it's common and well known to many theosophists. And I have a little screenshot from the Theosophy Trust on the internet. It's the Pledge of Kuan Yin. And Kuan Yin is also a bodhisattva who is yet another incarnation, you might say, of the same bodhisattva as the Dalai Lama. And so the pledge, I'll read it, is as follows, even though you all know it pretty much already. Never will I seek to receive private individual salvation. Never will I enter into final peace alone, but forever and everywhere will I live and strive for the redemption of every creature throughout the world from the bonds of conditioned existence. That's the Kuan Yin pledge. Well, thank you very much. And let's go into some discussion and comments and maybe help me to understand these laws. Let me stop the share here. I'm going to make my Zoom a little bigger so I can see any raised hands. All right, Judy, I see Judy there. Judy, take it away.
We can't hear you, Judy. You need to unmute.
Yeah,
Judy,
I did my noise
there
in
you
my house. Yeah. Schopenhauer is an important figure in bringing Buddhism to the west. But I wonder if you agree, he didn't get it quite right, because he talks about assertion and denial of the will. And he talks about denial of the will to live, which I think is true in terms of you deny the sensational will to live, but you don't deny the will to go on with the life principle. So I think the problem with Schopenhauer and with some of the other German philosophers like Schlagenweit is they thought the Nirmanakaya body was actually the physical body that the Nirmanakaya incarnates into, but that isn't really the Nirmanakaya body. So I think there's some distortion in Schopenhauer, although he did a service. So could you explain a little bit more about what the Nirmanakaya body really is? Because it is a sacrifice that we will all have to make, but this doesn't mean that we're going to, sacrifice our life or live in a depressing state. And Schopenhauer can get a little depressing. I've read him in the German, and I know this, but he does recognize the law of compassion, which I think is very good for you to point out. So thank you very much for that and your whole presentation.
Well, much appreciated, Judy. I'm glad to hear what you had to say. Yes, I think even Schopenhauer's wife, as I was looking at his biography, his mother broke off relationships with him because she saw him as being too cynical and sour and very very negativistic in his perception of the world. And I think that paradox I was mentioning, he kind of went too far on one side of the paradox, which is to be detached from the senses, but yet still, like in the Bodhisattva, acting and doing your duty. So being involved in the world, but yet being detached from the world. And that the sacrifice of the kayas, indeed, that ultimate sacrifice is to become less and less attached to the concerns of humans. However, the Bodhisattva is existing, as in the Kuan Yin pledge, principally to help the humans and to help us in our physical form and to help sentient beings. So I think, yeah, Schopenhauer kind of took a little left turn there towards the negative in his talk about these Buddhist bodies. And somewhere in Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky gives a particular criticism of some of these German European Orientalists who kind of got it wrong about what these physical bodies are.
Yes, yeah, you're quite right. And this led to the misperception of many Western philosophers that Buddhism is nihilism. And I had to argue against this in many cases professionally. So thank you. I think this needs to be cleared up. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks, Judy.
All right.
And do we have any other comments, or observations, or insights?
Well, it seems that's a warning to us, isn't it, in our study of theosophy? As we go deeper into theosophy and learn more about it, we have to be completely aware and leave out no department of nature, but include it all.
Yes, yes, Laura. Thank you for that. Because indeed, part of the Voice of the Silence also talks about, as we move along this path, we'll become, in a sense, to use a New Age lingo, we'll become a co-creator with nature. As we sacrifice more and more and become less and less selfish and self-centered about our egoic little s self, then we become more in alignment with the big S self. Then we can become an adept and arhat and really a co-creator with nature. I see a hand raised from Kirk Braden. You want to take it away there, Kirk?
Yes, thank you, Ken, very much for your talk. I'm thrilled and at the same time awed by your willingness to take on some of the deeper mysteries, really, of the Voice of the Silence and try to address the three kayas, because it's a very sort of unknown realm in terms of the exact definition and relationship of the three, and the meaning of the three. We're given very little in the philosophy, although there is a work that was published after HPB's death. It's called The Mystery of the Buddha, and it was republished in another form by CGP, where she does give some more sort of suggestive information, exactly pertaining to this whole idea that even once an enlightened being leaves the physical vesture, that they maintain in the subtle, less substantial realms of nature. When we would refer it very broadly to the astral, but it actually also includes the akashic. When you're talking about an enlightened being, you're talking about a being who is informed by and a craftsman of the akasha, which is it's the higher realm of archetypes and of true wisdom and knowledge and of the logos itself. So they become avenues by which that wisdom that's inherent in the deepest intelligence of nature, that by which nature is given birth, they become avenues by which that wisdom is brought into our cycle of evolution. And that's this part of this critical function of the guardian wall. But exactly what the Nirmanakaya is, and by the way, in different schools of Buddhism, you also find more than 3 kayas. In some there are 5, and some there are 7. So it's what we have in the voice of the silence is a very partial sort of suggestion about the reality, this cosmic human reality, because that's the other thing, as you mentioned, that when a being reaches that level of wisdom, as it's said in the voice, they become one with the light and the sound of the logos, right? So there is no longer any separation or distance between that inherent spiritual light by which all beings are emanated and come into being in any given cycle. So they're active participants, but also self-conscious. And the other thing to add in that apparently is part of this idea of a Nirmanakaya vesture is that it's maintaining its awareness of the particular cycle that humanity is going through at any particular time, right? So that the wisdom that is appropriate for that age, for those people, for the nation into which it incarnates, for the cycle in which it is participating, the exact wisdom that's not going to be too much, because we know if we're given too much, it just goes over our head, right? Or we misuse it, or we abuse it in some way, So it's this vesture which maintains that continuity of awareness of a particular cycle, while also continually resonating with that which is utterly universal and beyond, even you could say our chain of globes, right? Because the logos itself has its reality in that part of nature which precedes even our particular chain of globes. So anyway, it's this. So it's a very dynamic vesture in that sense, that it maintains its connection with the very highest, while also being appropriate for the time and the age in which the next incarnation may take place. So just to add a few tidbits, a very marginal understanding that I have of it, and that's really just due to what we find in the writings. So, but again, thank you so much for bringing us to consider and think about these kayas, these vestures more deeply.
Well, thank you, Kirk, for that bit of words and knowledge and wisdom about the kayas. I'm fascinated to hear that different schools of Buddhism have different numbers of kayas. So again, it'd be like the 5 koshas and the 7 septenary natures, so different numerations and different subdivisions, sort of like a taxonomy, if you will. My guess is that some of the more advanced kayas for the person on this astral or more advanced plane that's no longer in the physical might have nuances of meaning and nuances of responsibility in what they do.
Yes.
The other, I think, rather fascinating and interesting and seemingly quite relevant idea that you mentioned, Kirk, is the idea that the adept in a particular kalpa and culture and civilization is going to have knowledge and verbiage and lingo and language and experiences of that particular age or culture or that set of beings, presuming that human beings on Earth are not the only beings that are out there. There are different adepts that would be, appropriate to different species of critters on different planets, and that adept would then have a connection to those people with their experience, and that as one goes through these kayas, then some of that knowledge and wisdom and connection would still exist, so that it's possible to have compassion, and yet on the other hand, with this renunciation, let go of the connection to that kind of compassion.
Mm.
And the second big thing you mentioned, Kurt, was the guardian wall. And I didn't make too much of a deal on that today. I had been planning to talk about it a little bit more, but I find that to be a fascinating idea. From my thinking about it and reading for today, it looked like that as this bodhisattva progresses in this obligatory pilgrimage and then leaves the physical form and then goes into the kaya vestures, that ultimately this it was kind of predicted, voiced in the voice of the silence. So the language was self-doomed through future kalpas to be unthanked and unperceived by man, wedged as a stone with countless other stones, other bodhisattvas in the guardian wall. And that's a fascinating idea. And I believe in Rosicrucianism, of all things. I've come across this idea that there's a shell of protective spirits around the earth in our manifestation. And so I think they have a similar inclination or a similar intuition that there's a guardian wall. And that it would really be, I think what the voice in Blavatsky reveals to us is that the guardian wall is actually made up of advanced humans who have moved along this obligatory pilgrimage, along this pathway of consciousness and development and sacrifice and renunciation, to be able to form that protective guardian wall, that protective quality. I see a hand from Eileen. Eileen, take it away there. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Oh, Eileen, you're still muted.
Until she's ready to speak, just to follow up, Ken, on a couple
Yes,
of points. The one thing we would want to affirm in terms of theosophical thought is that these are vestures that are all cultivated and developed during life, right? So it's not something that only occurs in after-death states or something like that. It has to be created and consciously entered into and cultivated over lifetimes, but while in incarnation, right? Because that's where causes can be set up for that to occur. And Judge does talk a little bit also about it in his articles on the culture of concentration, where he mentions that in the process of spiritual development, through the cultivation of concentration, which he also connects intimately with the development of the paramitas. He says that the two go hand in hand; they cannot be separated. And any suggestion that somehow you could develop the capacity to concentrate, to focus, to develop the intuitive faculty while in separation from morality, a deepening, deepening sensitivity to the moral dimension of nature, ever deepening patience, tranquility, cultivation of love, and so on. That to think that those two can happen separately is a mistaken notion. They have to all go together, and that in that process there's this like a natural drawing away from identification with the physical vesture. And so that at some point there is this capacity to simply, as is spoken of the great Tulkus, to leave the physical vesture and to consciously go to the next birth, to enter and to make that transition between births consciously with continuity of purpose and intent and discipline and so on. And that's the other great example that we have in Tibetan Buddhism, right? Is the example of the Tulkus, who are have now there's many documented and recognized occasions of beings reincarnating. Their next incarnation is known. The previous one is known. It's known who they were. They're identified, and it's because they have created this vesture in which they can even transcend over what to us is a great chasm, the chasm of death, into the next incarnation and continue the same effort.
Well, thank you for mentioning those tulkus and talking about them. Yes, reincarnation is a fascinating thing. And some years ago, Ken Wilber, this kind of popular American philosopher, non-academic, has talked about reincarnation. Says, I don't like to lead with reincarnation. I suspect it's out there, and references some books like, several lifetimes suggestive of reincarnation and that sort of thing. But I think the modern ideas and data that you're talking about, Kirk, with the Tulkus is really more relevant and more pertinent to the idea that, to the observations that yes, the reincarnation can occur. And I'm wondering if that has anything to do with some of the phraseology and some of the admonitions in the voice of the silence, that one must be able to kill off the lunar body, or I guess you might say the lower level astral body. So we have the physical body and this lower level astral, and then the tulku would be at another octave, if you will, of embodiment that would hold that thread of continuity, and then periodically from time to time come back into the physical form.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it's very much connected. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. And this has been quite a good presentation and an interesting contemplation for me on this law of compassion. One question that I had during the presentation is this one universal law that Blavatsky talks about, first the number, then no number in stanza 4, and the idea that there's this ultimate law of karma, and then we have this one abstract law of compassion. Are they all really the same thing, just with different words? Like a rose is a rose is a rose by any other name. What do you guys think out there? Or have you read about that? Jonathan?
Well, I think in the Light of Asia, karma is called the law of love. So, and he talks about the one law. I mean, Light of Asia is like a kind of a poetical rendition of the life of Buddha, right?
Yes.
And the main events, right? But there's other people here that can probably quote that better than I could. But karma itself is called the law of love.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some other aspects to it. But karma, per se, you could almost say doesn't have any attributes. It's just it's just a law. And one thinks that this idea of not having attributes, it's that it's not a gushy emotional thing, but it's just like this expression of unity and interdependence, perhaps. But I don't know if that answers the question, but it may approach it. I don't know if anybody was able to hear me. That's an experiment. Can a person 6 feet away from a microphone hear the person speaking or not? Did you guys hear that?
You sounded understandable, but a little bit like you were underwater.
Oh, wow.
Because here in the lodge, this is the the inaugural maiden voyage, if you will, of doing Zoom in the lodge with people in the room and people on Zoom. It's sort of a hybrid meeting, and getting all the microphones and everything set up is a little tricky. But what Jonathan was saying is that the law of karma is sometimes called the law of love. And then this one law of compassion, it has a very similar thing, because for me, compassion and love kind of go together with empathy and love and that sort of thing. And so they're all kind of unified. And for me, Jonathan was talking about what does it mean to have no attributes and to be a law. So from the world of physics, like MIT and Caltech and scientific physics, we have a bunch of different physical laws. And we say, oh yeah, I'm comfortable with that from high school physics class or college studying physics or whatever. And some of those say, like electromagnetism, you'd say, well, electromagnetism is governed by laws, and there's mathematical formulas that describe, force and energy of an electromagnetic capacity. And yet you would say, in and of itself, electricity doesn't have any moralistic values, you might say. No, you could say, well, maybe in a sense it's without attributes, even though it's operating and doing stuff. So the electricity doesn't care if you're microwaving your food, or if you're running this ring light that's illuminating my face right here, or if it's electricity that's running the headlights in the cars out on the street, or if it's electricity that would be, say, electrocuting a criminal at Sing Sing with a death penalty. It's like, okay, that seems very, very, very different, having a positive effect of electromagnetism or a negative effect of electromagnetism. So in a sense, you might say that there's an analogy of a law of physics, which is more concrete, that has no attributes to it. Or gravitation, for instance. You might say gravity doesn't really care one way or the other, what happens to things, and yet our solar system depends upon gravity, and the Earth and the moon. Like I said, today is the harvest moon, full moon day on September 10th. So those gravitational bodies, you might say gravity has no attributes, even though we have qualities in a sense, but you could say in itself, it doesn't really care. It has detached itself from any connection to the Earth or the moon or the sun or anything like that. It just operates. Any other thoughts about the laws and this one universal law and how these might be the same and relate to each other?
Well, that was interesting the way you put it, Ken. I would just a couple of thoughts, short ones. If karma is that law which provides for continuity between one manvantara and the next manvantara, or you could say between the whole string of endless series of manvantaras, it is that law of continuity which assures that cause and effect is always operating. Then it does become the law of unity, right? This all-encompassing. It's all-encompassing, and if you were to assign an attribute to it other than that of unity, it would be misleading, perhaps, right? But the other thing that karma seems to also be, you could say, to represent, is that with each evolution, there's a higher level of perfection. So it is also a motion in which there's, it's a spiraling motion upward, apparently. That's inherently part of that, of its nature. So that's just some aspects of it. But then in terms of our human experience, we could say that that karma is that law which always brings to the soul, inevitably, always and without error, that which it most needs to undo the errors of the past, to and to build upon the good. That's one of the ways that it's described, right? And what could you imagine? What would be more compassionate than that? than providing the opportunity to examine, oh, this is where I've gone wrong in the past. Oh, this is how I can correct my errors. This is how I can evolve better as a human being. There's something for me to learn here. It's always providing that opportunity for learning, which does seem very much aspect of compassion, right?
Yes, I agree. I think the idea of building skills through practice, like I was mentioning, baking a cake with the recipe and getting better and better. First, you have, like a lump of dough as a cake, but then eventually you get something nice at the end. So practicing the skill of compassion is a good thing. As we are in this theater of space-time that I talk about in our manifested form, as we go through this, through Mantaras and Himalayas and all these. There is a curious thing, though, with this all happening, that time in itself, time is one of these concrete attributes. And perhaps as the consciousness of the universe is having its manifestation in all these different forms and all these different times, it's allowing itself to have different experiences for the further growth and development of the whole shooting match, you might say, of the whole emanations of manifestation. One thing I want to mention is William Quan Judge in the Blue Book, the Theosophical Tenets that we look at on some of the Sundays here in the San Diego ULT. There's aphorisms on karma, and in it, Judge quotes that Judge's quote is saying that karma is both merciful and just, and that mercy and justice, these two things, are opposite poles of a single whole. That mercy without justice is not possible in the operations of karma. And that which man calls mercy and justice is therefore defective, errant, and impure. And that there's, as Judge points to with this saying that karma is both merciful and just, this idea that there is some unity, that there's some universality to that aspect of our day-to-day morality, our day-to-day consciousness that we can point to and look at.
Well, I think our time is actually come to a close here.
All right, Jonathan,
I'll
want to come over here? They can hear you better on this side? Yeah.
Why not?
All right, everything's all new here. We're just trying to figure out stuff. So I just wanted to mention, first of all, thank you very much, Ken. Very comprehensive, and it's just so uplifting, and I think it's just very auspicious, and I'm just very happy we're able to kind of open our lodge on this kind of a keynote. So, and also to bring you all into this lodge. So we'll see how this goes in the future. We'll probably get better and better at our craft and be able to even start the meetings on time. Wouldn't that be something? And then, okay, so next week, we'll hear Wes Ammerman. He's going to drive all the way down from Long Beach down to San Diego. And he's going to do something on reflections on self-discipline. So that ties in with what we've been talking about today, about bringing things to a focus and getting some traction. Also, after that, we'll be hearing from somebody not in California, in other words, somebody in Japan. And he's going to be talking about the chrysanthemum, the symbolism of the chrysanthemum flower, because we've heard before about the rose and the lotus, right? So now we're going to learn about the chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemums are big in Japan, just so you know. He'll tell us more about it later. His title of it is Mom's the Word, Thoughts on the Chrysanthemum. And then after that, Monica will be helping us understand, Monica Page, the idea of Sarvodaya. And that's kind of a Gandhian subject, concept. And because his birthday is October 2nd, so that occasion will be on October 1st. Sarvodaya, a sacred dream of a society yet to be born. So I'm sure that'll be very uplifting. And then Desiree will be talking about creativity. She'll probably fancy up the title a little bit, but so far the title is just creativity. And that'll be on October 8th. So we've got a lot to look forward to. Thank you all very much. And anybody who wants to attend our secret doctrine class tomorrow morning at 10:30 California time, just click on this link that you clicked on to go to this one. Doesn't matter. So anyway, thank you all very much. And above all, thank you, Ken, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Ken.
Much appreciated.
You did
Yeah.
a terrific job.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, much appreciated. Great discussion, and my honor to be able to talk today on the
Thank you.
harvest moon.
You have this one.
Bye-bye, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And is, who's running the meeting?
I
And
guess you
is it here or end?
Is that what it, does that do it? Right
Yeah.
there?